13 children walked into Pinewood Forest on a crisp October morning in 1990. None of them ever walked out. The entire Boy Scout Troop 47 vanished without a trace. No screams, no struggle, no blood. Just 23 empty sleeping bags and a campfire still smoldering when the search teams arrived. For 15 years, that forest kept its secrets buried beneath layers of fallen leaves and winter snow. But secrets have a way of clawing their way back to the surface. If you love true mysteries, like and subscribe and comment where you're watching from. In 2005, a lone hiker named Alex Chen was threading her way through those same woods when something caught her eye. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that would crack open the most haunting cold case in Minnesota history and reveal a truth so disturbing that investigators are still piecing together the fragments today. She spotted a weathered leather pouch nestled against the base of an ancient oak tree, partially buried under 15 years of decomposing leaves. The leather was cracked and faded, but still intact, and carved into its surface, barely visible through the wear and weather, were two numbers that made her blood run cold. 4, 7, Troop 47. Alex's hands trembled as she reached toward the pouch, her fingertips just inches away from answers that families had been desperately seeking for over a decade. But what they found beneath that bark will shock you. Pinewood Forest stretches across 12,000 acres of untamed wilderness in northern Minnesota. It's the kind of place where cell towers can't reach and GPS signals die between the towering pines. Thick canopies block out most sunlight even at midday, creating a perpetual twilight that makes every shadow feel alive with possibility. The forest had been considered safe for decades. Local scout troops had been camping there since the 1960s without incident. Parents trusted it. Kids loved it. The closest road was 8 miles away through winding deer trails that required experienced guides to navigate. That's what made the disappearance of Troop 47 so impossibly terrifying. 13 boys ages 11 to 14, along with their 3 adult leaders, had set up camp at the designated site on Friday evening. They'd followed all protocols, checked in with park rangers, filed their route plans, carried emergency beacons, everything by the book. Saturday morning, when they failed to report their scheduled check-in, Ranger Station 12 sent a team to investigate. What they found defied explanation. The campsite looked like everyone had simply evaporated mid-activity. Breakfast was half prepared on camp stoves. A scout handbook lay open to a page about knot tying, a pencil still marking someone's place. Shoes were lined up neatly outside tents as if their owners had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second. But no footprints led away from the site. No signs of struggle. No indication anyone had ever left voluntarily or otherwise. The largest search operation in state history followed. Over 300 volunteers combed every inch of those woods for 6 straight weeks. They brought in helicopters, search dogs, thermal imaging equipment, even psychics desperate families had hired privately. They found nothing. Absolutely nothing. For 15 years, 13 families have lived in a state of suspended grief, caught between hope and despair. They've endured false leads, fake psychic visions, and cruel hoaxes from attention seekers. Some parents refused to move houses, convinced their children might find their way home. Others couldn't bear to stay in the same town where their boys had last been seen alive. The case file grew thick with theories but thin on evidence. Abduction seemed impossible given the location. Natural disasters couldn't explain the lack of remains. Even the most experienced investigators admitted they'd never encountered anything like it. Until now, every search party came up empty. Alex Chen had been hiking solo for 7 years, ever since her divorce finalized, and she realized she needed something that belonged entirely to her. No shared custody arrangements, no compromised destinations, no one else's schedule to accommodate. Just her boots, her backpack, and whatever trail called to her that weekend. She'd discovered Pinewood Forest the previous spring, during a particularly dark period, when work stress and loneliness seemed to press against her chest like a physical weight. Something about the cathedral silence between those towering pines had offered the kind of peace she couldn't find anywhere else. The forest demanded nothing from her except respect and attention. This October morning, She'd driven 3 hours from Minneapolis before dawn, needing to escape another sleepless night of overthinking every decision she'd made in the past year. Her journalism background made her mind naturally gravitate toward unsolved puzzles. But lately, that same curiosity felt more like a curse than a gift. Alex adjusted her hiking boots at the trailhead, double-checking the laces with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that small oversights could become big problems in the wilderness. The morning air carried that sharp, clean scent of pine needles and decomposing leaves that signaled autumn's final act before winter claimed the forest. She'd packed light, just water, trail mix, her camera, and a first aid kit. This was supposed to be a simple day hike, a chance to clear her head and maybe capture some photos of the fall foliage for her neglected Instagram account. Her friends had been encouraging her to get back out there, to share more of herself with the world again. Alex shouldered her pack and took her first steps down the familiar trail, breathing deeply as the canopy closed overhead and the sounds of civilization faded behind her. This was her sanctuary, the Panchayat, one place where her restless mind could finally quiet down and just exist in the present moment. She had no idea she was about to stumble into the biggest story of her career. For the first 2 miles, everything felt perfectly normal. Squirrels chattered in the branches above. Leaves crunched beneath her feet in a satisfying rhythm. The October sun filtered through the canopy in golden shafts that made the whole forest feel enchanted. But then something shifted in the atmosphere. Something so subtle she almost missed it. Alex first noticed the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet she'd come to love about Pinewood Forest. This was different, heavier, more complete. The kind of silence that makes you suddenly aware of your own heartbeat and the sound of your breathing. Even the wind seemed to have died away, leaving the trees motionless against the gray October sky. She'd stopped walking without realizing it, standing frozen on the trail as some primitive part of her brain registered that something fundamental had changed in the environment around her. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. That's when she saw the oak tree. It stood about 30 yards off the main trail, ancient and massive, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter. Alex had passed this way before, but something about the tree commanded her attention now in a way it never had. Maybe it was the way the morning light hit its gnarled bark, or the perfect circle of fallen leaves that surrounded its base like a natural shrine. Or maybe it was the small, dark object nestled against the trunk that definitely hadn't been there during her previous hikes. Alex left the trail and approached the tree carefully, her journalist instincts immediately cataloging details. The object was partially buried under layers of decomposed leaves, but its edge caught the filtered sunlight and revealed itself to be made of leather. Old leather, cracked and weathered by years of exposure to the elements. Her pulse quickened as she got closer and realized what she was looking at. A leather pouch, roughly the size of a paperback book, secured with a tarnished metal clasp that had somehow survived whatever elements had tried to claim it. The leather had faded from what was probably once a rich brown to a mottled gray-tan color, but the craftsmanship was still evident. This wasn't some piece of modern camping gear. This looked like something that belonged in a museum, or maybe a historical reenactment. Alex knelt beside the tree, her hands hovering over the pouch as her mind raced through possibilities. Lost camping equipment didn't survive 15 Minnesota winters looking this intact, and something about the positioning seemed too deliberate, too protected by the tree's massive root system to be accidental. She pulled out her phone to take a photo, but her screen showed no signal bars. Of course, this deep in Pinewood Forest, she might as well be on another planet. As far as modern technology was concerned, Alex looked closer at the pouch and felt her breath catch in her throat. There, carved into the leather with what looked like a knife point, were numbers that made the rational part of her mind reject what she was seeing. The carving was crude but unmistakable, worn smooth by weather but still clearly legible. 4 dots, 7, 47, or Troop 47. Every person in Minnesota knew that number. It had been burned into local consciousness by years of news, coverage, anniversary articles, and documentary specials. Troop 47, the Boy Scouts who vanished without a trace 15 years ago from somewhere in this very forest. Alex's hands trembled as she reached toward the pouch, her rational mind warring with the impossibility of what she was seeing. This couldn't be connected to that case. Could it? Forensic teams had combed every inch of these woods. How could they have missed something this significant? But as her fingertips brushed the cracked leather surface, she realized that maybe they hadn't missed it. Maybe it hadn't been here to find 15 years ago. Alex hesitates. What's inside remains hidden. The metal clasp felt ice cold against Alex's fingertips, its surface rough with 15 years of rust and corrosion. She could feel her pulse hammering in her throat as she worked the latch, each small movement producing a tiny rasp of metal against metal that seemed impossibly loud in the absolute silence of the forest. The mechanism was stiff, reluctant to yield after so many seasons of exposure. Alex had to apply steady pressure, working the clasp back and forth with the patience of someone who understood that forcing it might destroy whatever lay inside. As she worked, she became acutely aware of how alone she was out here. Miles from the nearest road, hours from when anyone might think to look for her. The realization sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the October air. The forest around her remained unnaturally quiet, as if every creature within miles had suddenly decided to hold its breath and watch what she was about to discover. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of other hikers, just the soft scrape of corroded metal and her own increasingly rapid breathing. Alex glanced up at the massive oak tree towering above her and felt a strange sense of being watched. The tree's branches seemed to lean inward, creating a natural cathedral ceiling that focused attention downward to this moment, this discovery, this violation of secrets the earth had kept buried for over a decade. Her hands were shaking now, whether from adrenaline or the growing cold, she couldn't tell. The clasp gave slightly under her persistent pressure, and she felt something shift inside the pouch. Something that moved with a soft whisper against the leather, like papers or fabric settling into a new position. The sound made her pause. Whatever was inside had been preserved, well enough to retain some of its original texture and flexibility. That level of preservation seemed almost impossible given the conditions, but then again, the pouch itself had survived far better than it should have. Alex took a deep breath and applied one more careful twist of pressure to the clasp. It gave way with a soft click that echoed strangely in the silent woods. "We'll show you the contents in a moment." Alex carefully lifted the pouch and tucked it inside her jacket, feeling its unexpected weight against her ribs. The leather was surprisingly heavy, suggesting whatever lay inside was substantial. Her mind raced as she hurried back toward the trail, every journalist instinct screaming that she'd stumbled onto something extraordinary. But protocol demanded she involve the authorities. This wasn't just a story, this was potential evidence in a case that had haunted Minnesota for 15 years. The hike back to Ranger Station 12 took 45 minutes, though it felt like hours. Alex found herself glancing over her shoulder repeatedly, unable to shake the feeling that the forest was watching her carry away its secret. The unnatural silence persisted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath to see what she would do with her discovery. Ranger Lee Morrison had been working Pinewood Forest for nearly 2 decades. He'd seen lost hikers stumble out half dead from exposure, found bones from animals that died decades ago, and dealt with his share of false leads from well-meaning visitors who thought they'd found clues related to the Troop 47 case. But when Alex placed the leather pouch on his desk and explained where she'd found it, something shifted in his weathered features. "Jesus," he whispered, leaning closer without touching the artifact. "Where exactly did you say this was?" Alex described the location in detail. The ancient oak, the circle of leaves, the way the pouch had been nestled against the trunk, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. Lee's frown deepened with each detail. "Ma'am, I've walked past that tree hundreds of times in the past 15 years. We searched that area with fine-tooth combs after the disappearance. Dogs, metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar. The whole 9 yards." He shook his head slowly. "This wasn't there." "What are you saying?" Alex asked, though she already suspected the answer. "I'm saying either we missed something obvious for 15 years, which seems impossible given the resources we threw at this case, or—" He trailed off, studying the pouch with growing unease. Or someone put it there recently, Alex finished. Lee nodded grimly, which raises some very disturbing questions about who might have had access to Troop 47 artifacts all this time. They stared at the pouch in silence for a moment, both understanding that opening it would cross a line from which there might be no return. This wasn't just a hiking discovery anymore. It was potentially crucial evidence in an active investigation. "We need to document everything before we proceed," Lee said finally, reaching for his camera. "Chain of custody, photographs, witness statements. If this is what I think it might be, the FBI is going to want to know about it within the hour." As Lee photographed the pouch from every angle, Alex couldn't help but notice how his hands trembled slightly. This man had spent years dealing with the aftermath of the disappearance, fielding calls from desperate families, coordinating search efforts that led nowhere. The weight of 15 years of failure was etched into every line of his face. "You know what the worst part is?" Lee said quietly as he adjusted his camera settings. "We never found so much as a shred of fabric, a dropped water bottle, a footprint leading away from that campsite. It was like they just evaporated. But if this pouch contains what I think it does..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Alex understood. Evidence meant the boys had been somewhere after the disappearance. Evidence meant there might be answers to questions that had tortured 13 families for over a decade. Evidence meant someone had been keeping secrets. Lee set down his camera and looked directly at Alex. "Before we open this, I need you to understand something. Once we cross this line, there's no going back. If what's inside confirms our worst fears, it changes everything. Are you prepared for that?" Alex nodded, though her mouth felt dry as dust. Lee reached for a pair of latex gloves and snapped them on with practiced efficiency. Then, with the careful movements of someone who understood the gravity of the moment, he gently opened the ancient clasp. He realizes it defies all he's ever known. The first thing that emerged from the pouch was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age but remarkably well preserved. Lee lifted it out with tweezers, his movements deliberate and careful, as if he were handling an ancient artifact that might crumble at the slightest touch. But as he unfolded the paper under the bright desk lamp, both he and Alex realized they weren't looking at some historical document. This was a hand-drawn map, sketched in pencil on what appeared to be a page torn from a scout handbook. The drawing was crude but detailed, showing landmarks that were unmistakably from Pinewood Forest. Alex recognized the distinctive shape of Mirror Lake, the rocky outcropping locals called Devils, Backbone, even the ranger station where they now sat. But there were other markings on the map, annotations and symbols that made no immediate sense. And there, in the upper right corner of the map, drawn with heavy, deliberate strokes, was a large X. "That's not anywhere near the original campsite," Lee said, his voice barely above a whisper. He pulled out a topographical map of the forest and compared the two documents side by side. "This X is marking a location about 3 miles northeast of where we found the empty tents." Alex leaned closer, studying the crude map. Around the X, someone had drawn what looked like trees, but with strange symbols carved into their trunks. There were also numbers scattered around the marking. Dates, maybe, or coordinates. The handwriting was shaky, as if drawn by someone under stress or in poor lighting. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of small marks near the bottom of the map. "These look like they might be..." She paused, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "Are those supposed to be graves?" Lee's face went pale. The small rectangular shapes were arranged in neat rows, each one marked with initials that were too faded to read clearly. But there were 13 of them. Exactly 13. "We need to call this in immediately," Lee said, reaching for his radio. But Alex caught his wrist. "Wait, what if we're wrong? What if this is just some elaborate hoax or a prop from one of those paranormal investigation shows that film out here sometimes?" She gestured at the map. "Shouldn't we at least verify the location exists before we bring in the cavalry?" Lee hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the possibility of walking into another dead end that would give false hope to grieving families. "The coordinates on this map," Alex continued, "they're specific enough that we could hike there in less than 2 hours. If there's nothing there, we save everyone a lot of heartache. If there is, something ... Then we call in the FBI and let them handle it properly, Lee finished. He studied the map again, calculating distances and terrain in his head. It's a difficult hike. The area this X marks is some of the most remote territory in the forest. No established trails, thick undergrowth, steep ravines. But accessible? Accessible, yes. But dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Alex met his gaze steadily. Then it's a good thing I'm with someone who does. What lies? At that 10, stay with us. The hike to the coordinates marked on the map took them through terrain that felt increasingly untouched by human presence. Lee led the way, his experienced eyes reading the forest like a familiar book, while Alex followed close behind, trying to match his careful footsteps through the undergrowth. They moved in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what they might find. The weight of the discovery pressed against them with each step deeper into the wilderness. Every snapped twig under their boots seemed unnaturally loud. Every bird call made them pause and listen for sounds that didn't belong. The forest here was different from the well-traveled areas near the main trails. Older, wilder. The canopy was so thick that even at midday, they moved through a perpetual twilight, broken only by occasional shafts of golden sunlight that illuminated patches of moss-covered ground. This terrain matches what's drawn on the map, Lee said quietly, pausing to check their position against the crude sketch. We should be getting close. Alex wiped sweat from her forehead despite the cool October air. The exertion and adrenaline had her heart racing, but it was more than that. Something about this place felt heavy with presence, as if they were walking through a cathedral where terrible prayers had been whispered. They climbed over a fallen log that must have been down for decades, its trunk now serving as a nursery for an entire ecosystem of ferns and mosses. On the other side, the ground began to slope downward into a natural depression that wasn't visible on any official park maps. There, Lee breathed, pointing ahead. Through the trees, they could make out the remnants of human construction. Not the rough shelters that might be built by lost hikers, but something more permanent, more intentional. As they got closer, the structures resolved into a small clearing containing what appeared to be a primitive but well-constructed camp. 3 lean-to shelters built from carefully selected logs and branches, arranged around a central fire pit lined with stones. A simple water collection system channeled rainwater from nearby rocks into a series of containers. But what made Alex's blood run cold were the obvious signs that this place had been occupied recently. Very recently. Clothes hung on lines stretched between trees, faded and patched, but clean. A small garden plot showed evidence of cultivation, with root vegetables that looked ready for harvest. Most disturbing of all, pairs of boots were lined up neatly outside each shelter, ranging in size from what might fit a young teenager to adult proportions. My God, Lee whispered. Someone's been living out here. They approached the camp cautiously, both acutely aware that they might not be alone in these woods. Lee had his radio ready, though they both knew they were too far from any repeater station for it to be useful. Alex pulled out her camera and began documenting everything, her journalist training overriding her fear. Each photo captured another impossible detail: hand-carved utensils, books wrapped in plastic to protect them from moisture, a calendar scratched into the bark of a nearby tree with marks tracking days, weeks, months. Look at this, she called softly, crouching beside one of the shelters. Carved into the wood frame, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were initials: T, M, K, J, R, S, and others, some too weathered to read clearly. Lee joined her, running his fingers over the carved letters. These could be... He couldn't finish the sentence. The names of the missing scouts, Alex said what they were both thinking. But if this camp had been built by the missing boys, it raised questions that neither of them was prepared to confront. Questions about survival, about why no one had come forward, about what had kept 13 people hidden in these woods for 15 years. A sound echoed through the trees then, distant but unmistakable. The rhythmic thud of an axe against wood, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. Someone was here. Someone was still here. Lee and Alex locked eyes, both understanding that they had crossed from discovery into potential danger. Whoever had built this camp, whoever had been living here all these years, They weren't going to be happy about uninvited visitors stumbling across their secret. The axe sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the whisper of wind through pine needles and the thundering of two hearts that suddenly understood they might not be the hunters in this situation. They might be the prey. Lee motioned for Alex to stay low as they moved toward the largest of the three shelters. The structure was more sophisticated than it had appeared from a distance. Carefully chinked logs, a proper roof covered with layers of bark and moss, even crude windows covered with what looked like salvaged plastic sheeting. Inside, they found a scene that defied every assumption they'd made about what happened to Troop 47. The shelter was organized like a combination library and workshop. Shelves lined the walls, holding an eclectic collection of books, some obviously salvaged scout handbooks and wilderness survival guides, but others that must have been acquired over the years. Math textbooks, philosophy, even a few novels, all carefully wrapped in plastic to protect them from moisture. In one corner sat a workbench, where someone had been crafting tools and utensils from materials found in the forest. Knives shaped from scrap metal, bowls carved from burled wood, even a primitive but functional crossbow that spoke to years of patient development and refinement. But it was the wall opposite the entrance that made Alex gasp audibly. Covering nearly every inch of the rough wooden surface were carved records. Names, dates, events, a 15-year timeline etched into the wood with meticulous detail. Alex recognized some of the names from the original missing persons reports: Thomas Morrison, Kevin Jackson, Robert Sterling, Michael Chen. Michael Chen. Alex stared at the name, her heart hammering. Her own last name wasn't exactly uncommon, but the coincidence felt too strange to ignore. Lee, she whispered, pointing to one section of the timeline. Look at this entry, carved into the wood in careful block letters. Year 8. Winter was hard. Lost Tommy to pneumonia. Buried him with the others, near the Sunrise Rocks. Below that, more recent entries. Year 12. Kevin broke his leg, bad infection set in. Had to let him go. And then, Year 14. Only 7 of us left now. Food getting harder to find. May have to make contact soon. Lee was studying another section of the wall where someone had carved what appeared to be a detailed map of the surrounding area, marked with symbols indicating water sources, seasonal food locations, and what looked like burial sites scattered throughout the forest. They weren't kidnapped, Alex breathed, the full scope of what they were seeing finally sinking in. They survived. They've been surviving out here for 15 years. But why? Lee asked, his voice tight with confusion and growing horror. Why wouldn't they come home? Why wouldn't they let their families know they were alive? Before Alex could respond, a new sound drifted through the forest. Not the axe this time, but something that made both of them freeze in place. Whistling. Someone was whistling a tune as they approached the camp, the melody echoing strangely through the trees. It was a simple song, almost childlike in its repetition, but there was something deeply unsettling about hearing it in this place, at this moment. The whistling grew closer, accompanied now by the sound of footsteps on the forest floor. Heavy boots, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every root and stone in these woods. Lee grabbed Alex's arm and pulled her toward the back of the shelter, where a gap between the logs offered a view of the camp's central area. They crouched there in the shadows, hardly daring to breathe as the footsteps entered the clearing. Through the gap, Alex caught her first glimpse of one of the survivors. He was tall and lean, his hair and beard long and unkempt but clean. His clothes were a patchwork of materials, some obviously salvaged from the original camping trip, others fashioned from materials found or hunted in the forest. He moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness, but there was something in his posture, something in the way he held his head, that suggested years of hypervigilance. He was carrying the source of the axe sounds they'd heard, a freshly cut sapling that had been stripped and shaped into what looked like a walking stick or possibly a weapon. The man paused in the center of the camp and looked around slowly, his eyes scanning the area with the practiced attention of someone who had learned that survival depended on noticing when things were out of place. Then a faint whistle echoed through the trees. The whistle came from deeper in the forest, answered immediately by the man in the clearing. It wasn't a signal of alarm, Alex realized, but a communication system, a way for the survivors to stay in contact across the vast wilderness they'd made their home. More figures emerged from the tree line, three others all moving with the same quiet, confidence that spoke of years adapting to life in the wild. They were older than Alex had expected, no longer the children who had disappeared 15 years ago, but men in their late 20s and early 30s who bore the weathered features of people who had lived every day outdoors. And yet, there was something in their faces, a wariness, a kind of feral alertness that suggested their survival had come at a psychological cost that would be difficult to measure. Lee was already reaching for his radio, understanding that this discovery would require resources far beyond what the local ranger station could provide. These men would need medical evaluation, psychological support, and careful reintegration into a world that had moved on without them for 15 years. But Alex found herself thinking about the families. 13 sets of parents who had spent 15 years in agonizing uncertainty, never knowing whether to grieve or hope. The relief of knowing their children had survived would be overwhelming, but it would be tempered by the recognition of how much time had been lost, how much life had passed them by. She thought about her own parents, about how they would react to learning she had disappeared for 15 years, only to emerge as a stranger shaped by experiences they could never fully understand. The survivors in the clearing seemed to reach some kind of decision. The tallest of them, possibly one of the original adult leaders, though his appearance made it impossible to be certain, approached the shelter where Alex and Lee were hiding. "We know you're in there," he said quietly, his voice carrying the careful control of someone who had learned to manage fear through discipline. "We saw your tracks coming into the camp. We've been watching you since you left the ranger station." Alex and Lee exchanged glances. There was no point in hiding now. They emerged from the shelter, slowly, hands visible, making no sudden movements. The survivors watched them with the intense focus of prey animals evaluating a potential threat, but there was no immediate hostility in their posture. "You found the pouch," the tall man said. It wasn't a question. Lee nodded. "We're here to help. Families have been looking for you for 15 years. The whole state mourned for you." Something flickered across the man's face. Pain, longing, fear. "We know," he said simply. "We've been watching. We've seen the search parties, the news reports, the memorial, services." "Then why didn't you come forward?" Alex asked gently. "Why didn't you let people know you were alive?" The man looked back at his companions, some silent communication passing between them. When he turned back to Alex and Lee, his expression carried the weight of 15 years of impossible choices. "Because we couldn't be sure," he said, "that the thing we were hiding from had given up looking for us." 6 months later, the Pinewood Forest case would become one of the most studied survival stories in modern American history. Forensic psychologists, wilderness experts, and trauma specialists would spend years trying to understand how 13 people had managed to not just survive, but build a functioning community in one of Minnesota's most remote forests. The initial thing they had been hiding from turned out to be a combination of factors that had spiraled into tragedy and then, impossibly, into a kind of salvation. A brief encounter with a disturbed individual during their first night in the forest had convinced the boys and their leaders that they were being hunted. In their panic and inexperience, they had fled deeper into the wilderness rather than towards safety. By the time they realized their mistake, winter was setting in, and their survival skills had become more valuable than their ability to find their way back to civilization. Year by year, season by season, they had become more capable of living off the land and more convinced that the outside world had forgotten them. 7 of the original 16 had survived the 15 years in the wilderness. Their reintegration into society would be a slow, careful process guided by specialists who understood that their psychological landscape had been fundamentally altered by their experience. The family's relief was profound, but complicated by grief for those who hadn't survived and by the recognition that the children they had lost were now men shaped by experiences no parent could fully comprehend. Alex's article about the discovery would win a Pulitzer Prize, But she would always remember the moment she first saw those survivors more clearly than any professional accolade. The way they had looked at her and Lee, not as rescuers, but as representatives of a world they weren't sure they wanted to rejoin. The leather pouch that started it all now sits in the FBI's evidence archives, but copies of the map it contained hang in wilderness survival schools across the country. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the most impossible stories are the ones that turn out to be true. But questions remain. How did 7 people manage to stay hidden for 15 years in an area that was regularly searched? What happened to the other 9 members of Troop 47? And most disturbingly, what was the thing they believed they were hiding from during those first crucial days when rescue might still have been possible? The forest keeps some secrets, even when it finally releases others. What truly happened in those woods? And will we ever know the full truth?